Hello everyone and welcome to our second lecture here in our combo unit over chapters 21 and 22. And in this lecture we're going to venture to France. We're going to take a look at the reign of King Louis XIV, otherwise known as the Sun King. Alright, so let's get started. So before we can get to Louis XIV, we have to talk about his predecessors. So we're going to talk about Henry of Navarre. He's the first king of the Bourbon dynasty. Okay, Henry IV, that's going to be his title. A very decisive general and clever politician. Now this is important because the Bourbon dynasty is going to be the royal family in France up until the French Revolution in the late 1700s. Now he converted to Catholicism to appease the masses of France because the majority of France was Catholic at the time. And this is a good move on his part because it gained support his rulership. Now, in 1598, he declared the Edict of Nantes. Now, the Edict of Nantes is important because it allows the Huguenots, who are the basically French Calvinists, were being persecuted at the time in France, and it allows them to live in peace and have their own places of worship across the country. And that's important for religious toleration and religious freedom in France, and again, brings more power and support to him. Now, he rebuilds France to prosperity and restores the power of the French monarchy. Now, even though he does a lot of these good things, he unfortunately is stabbed to death by a fanatic in 1610. Alright, so he is killed even though he does some good things. Now, we're going to move on to his son, Louis XIII. Now, he's a very weak king, okay, but he did one really strong thing. He appointed a cardinal, the top religious figure in France. He appointed Cardinal Richelieu. Now, Cardinal Richelieu, because Louis is actually very, very weak, becomes the true ruler of France, even though he's not in name that, because he's a religious figure. He's very ambitious, very authoritative, uses his power significantly. And for those of you that are very familiar with the story of the Three Musketeers, this is the period in France that we're talking about, and Cardinal Richelieu is part of that. Now, what happens under Louis XIII under Cardinal Richelieu is the Bourbon power increases. Now, even though his father, Henry IV, had signed the Edict of Nantes, giving freedom and places of worship to the Huguenots, Richelieu, a devout Catholic, and remember he's the one controlling everything, acts against the Huguenots. And he ultimately works to weaken the power of the nobles so that the power of Louis XIII, and really himself, Richelieu, can be more in power. Again, this is kind of a move as part of the age of absolutism, even though effectively in this case, you actually have a religious figure doing kind of working the strings. The goal here is to make France the strongest state in Europe. Okay, and this actually is going to happen under Louis XIV, and France is going to become embroiled in a war that's going to be known as the 30 Years' War because of this goal. All right, now, we're going to take a little break and talk about skepticism, because we're going to be talking about the Enlightenment a little bit later on in this unit as well. So we got to talk about this first, because this is going to be happening during this period. So skepticism is the idea that nothing can be known for certain. And you start seeing in this period of time in France, thinkers are starting to express doubt towards old ideals, towards rulership and so forth, and they're going to start questioning ideas to try to find the truth, or as much as they can. Now, there's going to be two people in the skepticism movement that you're going to need to know. One is Montaigne, who's got the kind of the frilly thing around his throat there. He starts to develop a form of writing where you question, or at least try to find the truth, and that is going to be known as your guys' all favorite thing, the essay, which is a brief expression of thoughts and opinions. And he believed that absolute knowledge could never be attained. He believed that you could never absolutely know everything about anything. Okay, and then the last person here is René Descartes, who's in the upper right-hand corner. He believed that you needed to examine everything, and that you could never be certain of everything, and this is of anything. And this is important because this idea of questioning things, and this idea of writing by Montaigne and Descartes, are going to be important for what is going to be known as the Enlightenment. All right. Now we're going to move on to our Sun King, Louis XIV. Now he will ultimately become the most powerful French king in history. Okay, notice I said king and not emperor because some could argue that Napoleon will become that. But he begins his reign at the age of 4. Now, obviously, he's not going to be running a country as a king at 4. He has people do things in his stead. One person in particular is going to be another important religious figure, Cardinal Mazarin, and he is going to rule until Louis comes of age. And this happens at the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648. Now, Louis is going to become hated initially because he's going to increase his taxes, okay, and there's going to be a strengthening of the government. Okay, now he's going to do this, but also Mazarin's going to do this beforehand. And this is going to lead to violent riots. The rebellions are ultimately going to fail because of the distrust that's going to exist between the growing movements and so forth, so they can't kind of coordinate. And there's going to be violent repression by the French government to put these down. Now, this is important not so much because of when it actually happens, but because of the actions that Louis is going to have because of these revolts and these riots. He's actually never going to forget this, and he's going to lose trust in the lower classes, but in particular, he's going to lose trust in the nobility and how they didn't necessarily support the French crown or their actions during these revolts. So he's going to try to do his best to kind of curb their power and kind of use them against each other so he can control them throughout his reign. All right. So in 1661, Louis takes control at the age of 22. Okay, I know on the previous slide I misspoke about him taking control at the end of this 30 Years' War. That was still Mazarin, so my fault. Now he takes control at the age of 22 in 1621. The first thing he does is he starts to weaken the power of the nobility. Okay, and how he does this initially is he excludes them from any council meetings so that they don't really know what's exactly going on. All right, he starts to increase the power of the intendants, which basically they're just government tax collectors. So he's controlling the flow of money, while the nobility doesn't necessarily know what's going on and can't really control anything. He's assisted by his Minister of Finance in this, someone known as Jean-Baptiste Colbert. And he's an important figure because he believes in the idea of mercantilism. If you guys remember from the last chapter, mercantilism is all about increasing the wealth of the country. Okay, increasing the power of the country through wealth, with the goal of making France self-sufficient. So you see France expanding manufacturing, you see a rise in tariffs, and you start seeing Louis and Colbert and other French higher-ups trying to encourage people to settle in the colonies, specifically in America. Okay, now Louis does end the Edict of Nantes that was signed by Henry IV, and this is an important move because it actually loses him a significant number of skilled workers, which is actually against ultimately what he wants to do in bringing in more power and wealth to the French Empire. Now, let's talk about how he ruled in his style. He lived a life of luxury. Now, this life of luxury, and you guys can probably see it here with the Palace of Versailles, is ultimately what's going to get the Bourbon dynasty in trouble and going to lead to the French Revolution, one of the reasons anyways. He has the nobility, again, as a form of showing power over them, dress him every morning. He actually gets them to the point where they actually want to fight to do it. That's how he is able to use them against each other, how well he is anyways, able to use them against each other. Any noblemen that didn't show up were disapproved of, disallowed from court, thrown out of the Palace of Versailles. They'd actually be given small apartments in the Palace of Versailles if they had earned enough favor towards Louis XIV, and if they didn't show up or didn't do what he liked, he would kick them out. So the nobility, for all intents and purposes under Louis XIV, became solely dependent on him, okay, and what his actions were. When he lived in the Palace of Versailles, and I want you guys to take a little bit of time and actually look at these pictures, not just what's on the slide here, but we're going to actually see some here in the next couple of slides as well. And this shows off not only the power of the French Empire at the time, and the power of France in Europe, but also globally, and they become the center of the art world, center of the writing world. Anybody that's a playwright, architect, painter, any form of artist, they want to come to France because of the power of the French at this time and because of the promoting of it by Louis XIV and the money that's coming into France. All right, here's a picture of one of the main courtyards here in the Palace of Versailles. Very, very beautiful. Okay, and you can see they used throughout Versailles, there's various places they tried to use the reflection of the sun to show off the power of the the French Empire and the French King. This is one of the reasons why Louis is going to be known as the Sun King. Tried to show that connection with the sun by the use of light, reflection, and gold. Okay, here you can see the main grounds of the Palace of Versailles. This is a bigger picture of what you saw 2 slides ago. Look at just how ornate the building is and how beautiful it is, as well as the landscaping on the outside. And then this is a picture of the inside of what you just saw. Look at that main hall. Look at the ornate pieces of art, the architecture, the light that's coming in. Just very, very beautiful. I would actually pause this and take some time to actually view this picture. This is actually the same hallway, just taken from a different direction. We've kind of now come around. Okay, it doesn't look quite as bright and grandiose, but still, look at the beauty of it, the gold that's surrounding it, the artwork on the ceilings, chandeliers, and so forth. It's actually one of the main bedrooms. Again, look at the use of gold. Now, the gold railing wouldn't have been there at the time, but this has been added so that people that come in, tourists, wouldn't go right into the bed. But look at just ornateness, the art, the detail that exists in this room. Here you can see these are the grounds outside of the Palace of Versailles. Look at the reflecting pools, the landscaping. Very, very beautiful. All right, now let's talk about France in terms of why it becomes the most powerful country in Europe. And what are some of the reasons for why they're going to extend that power? Well, France is the most populated country in Europe at the time, over 20 million people, which means that it has the ability to have the biggest army. It also has the best training in weapons because of the funding and the military schools and so forth that exist in France. Now, in 1667, they invaded the Netherlands. They gained what is going to be known as the territory known as Franche-Comté. And this is basically northeastern France today, kind of the area kind of split between the Belgian-French border. Now, in the 1680s, nations start to ally against France to balance Europe out. And this is actually going to become a thing that's going to exist really for the rest of not only the 1600s, but the 1700s and in the early 1800s with the rise of Napoleon, because France is going to be able to take over or establish power more so than any of the other countries. So there needs to be alliances to help balance things out. So ultimately what you're going to see is you're going to see the Dutch, the English, the Swedish, the Prussians, the Spanish, and the Austrians at various times throughout this period are going to come together in alliances against France to help balance that power. Now, France, over the next century, is going to become weakened by bad harvests. That is actually going to be one of the main problems that's going to lead to the French Revolution. Constant warfare to whether they're extending their power, fighting against these alliances that are against them in various wars, and then the rise in taxes because they have to fund the warfare and then fund this expansion. And then also, we'll get into this later, the funding of another revolution. It's the American one. All right, let's go to the next one. Here you guys can see this is the Europe around the turn of the century in 1700. This is ultimately where you can see France is significantly, it's pretty much the borders that it is today, at least outside of a little bit here in terms of Savoy and Piedmont and so forth. A little bit in Lorraine, and then obviously a little bit along here in Belgium and so forth. All right, this is the breakdown of Europe, and this is about the time that Louis XIV is going to pass away. He's actually going to pass away a little bit later in 1714. Now, this is going to lead in 1700. The reason I showed you this map is because Charles II, the throne of the Spanish king, okay, he's going to die. He doesn't have any children. So it's going to lead to a series of wars known as the Wars of Spanish Succession. The throne is supposed to go to Philip of Anjou, who is Louis XIV's nephew. Now, here's the problem. If he gains that throne, Philip does, then the two greatest powers in Europe are going to be ruled by the same family, the Bourbons. Okay, so England, Austria, Portugal, as well as others, attack France and Spain. Okay, now, these wars are going to last for about 14 years, and they're going to end with the Treaty of Utrecht, which is going to be signed. Utrecht's a place in the Netherlands. Now, ultimately, what ends up happening in this treaty is they agree that Spain and France can't unite as one, because that's what ultimately I thought was going to take place under with Philip gaining the throne, is that Louis would just get to essentially control and seat over both of those countries. Now, the big winner in this is going to be Britain. And Britain's going to be the big winner because of two things. One, they're going to gain Nova Scotia, which is a giant island off the coast of Canada. That's going to lead to basically fishing rights, so money and fishing and trade there. But the big prize of this is going to be Gibraltar. And Gibraltar is going to be important because that's going to allow them to control access in and out of the Mediterranean Sea. That might not seem like a lot, but that means they're going to control one of the biggest choke points for trade in the world. And they still control it to this day, and that is going to be very, very vital for them. Whether it's going to be from in the 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, 20th century, and so on. I said 17th century, I meant to say 18th century there, sorry. All right. And again, here you can see this is the map in 1714. So if you go back, here's the map in 1700. Okay. And here's the map in 1714. Not a ton of change. Okay. But again, ultimately, the big change here, big winner here in Britain is going to be gaining Gibraltar down here, being able to control the ins and outs of Mediterranean trade. All right. Now let's talk and finish up Louis XIV. He has a mixed legacy. Okay, he dies in 1715, so right after the ending of the Spanish War for Spanish succession. The people rejoice from the suffering of the high taxes and the war, constant warfare. So there's kind of some bad things for him in terms of his rule, right? Okay, the constant warfare leads to huge debt and suffering among the people. Also, the cost of Versailles is a huge problem as well. That's a very ornate building. How do you fund it? Taxes. Who has to pay those taxes? Primarily the lower classes. Again, keep that in mind because it's going to be the reasons why. Some of the main reasons why the French populace is going to revolt against the Bourbons later on in the 18th century. Now, the positives for King Louis XIV's reign is he makes France the top power in Europe. Okay, actually, and you could argue globally for a time. France is also going to become the leader in art and literature across Europe. Okay, and they're going to maintain that for quite some time as well. And then they're also going to become the military leader in Europe, which is going to lead to increased trade and growing of colonies, specifically in the Americas. All right? And that's all I have for you guys. I hope you learned a lot here on the mixed legacy of King Louis XIV. And I will see you guys in the next one.